Protein, the fuel that's not. What? What I'm trying to say here is that protein is overemphasized in our society. Through marketing, through friends, family, doctors, nutritionists, everybody's just talking about protein and that we need to just throw it down our gullet. But the bottom line here is that we overconsume copious amounts of protein thinking that it is the elixir to optimum health. And that's just not the case. We need to moderate our intake of protein in order for us to be put in a state of ketosis. Now let's go over it together. Protein is not a source of energy. It can be used as one. So the key takeaway here is that fats and carbohydrates are going to be the body's primary fuel source. Proteins are going to be used to repair muscle tissue and human tissue all together. When it says it can be used as one, what we're trying to say here is that if the body needs to use protein, if its back is up against the wall and it doesn't have any other source of energy, it can actually take protein and it can change it into carbohydrates. Now, this would only happen if someone was on, say, a low carbohydrate diet, but also a low calorie diet. This would happen if, let's just say, when you decrease carbohydrates, but you don't replace it with anything like, say, fats, then protein is going to be next in line. Think of the Atkins diet. Lots of people just eat copious amounts of protein, lots of meat. So we have this reservoir, okay, of amino acids, which is the building blocks of protein. So when you don't have carbohydrates, when it's lower in the diet and your body is thirsting for fuel, it can use those proteins to fuel the body. Now, this is just something we don't want. Our constant need to consume copious amounts of protein is misunderstood. So in our society today, we see in marketing, we hear from friends and family and doctors, nutritionists, all these celebrity fitness trainers. We're hearing that protein is something that we need to be ingesting in copious amounts, when this in fact is not the case. When we're trying to put our body into ketosis, we need to have a moderate amount of protein. The reason is, and we're going to get to it in a little bit, is that protein can actually elicit the pancreas to an insulin response. Some amino acids, which we said are the building blocks of proteins, can elicit an insulin response. So this is something that we need to watch out for. Too much alanine or too little protein can be problematic when keto adapting. So alanine, this is going to be one of the 20 amino acids, the building blocks of protein, that can actually elicit a insulin response from the pancreas. So just as we said earlier with blood sugar levels and glycogen stores, we need to deplete those glycogen stores, and we also need to lower blood sugar in order for us to be put in a state of ketosis. All right? Insulin is the name of the game, making sure that we don't spike insulin. Now, alanine, like I said, is an amino acid, which is a protein, can elicit an insulin response. The biggest thing here is that the leaner meats, the chickens, these are going to be the proteins that are going to have larger amounts of alanine, all right? So just make sure when you're having meat, you're making sure that there's adequate fat in it. And the second piece to this bullet point, getting too little protein can be problematic when keto adapting. What can happen is you can decrease muscle mass because you're not getting enough amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of muscle. However, just remember this: getting too little protein won't necessarily have an effect on your body's ability to get into ketosis, okay? Protein intake can range from 10 to 30%. Ranges are highly dependent on a person's past/current health status and goals. A minimum of 1 to 2.2 grams per kilogram to avoid muscle loss. So we have our recommendation here. Protein is going to be between 10 and 30%. So that's a pretty big range, and you're probably thinking to yourself, well, where am I? It's supposed to be completely subjective and everybody's different. What's my protein recommendation? Great question. So I want you to think of this like how we talked about carbohydrates. If you're somebody who is more insulin resistant, you're going to have the lower limits of that protein and you're going to have the higher amount of fat. If you're an athlete and you're more insulin sensitive, then you're going to have closer to the upper limits because you want to keep your muscle mass and you can probably tolerate the higher protein. Now let's talk about protein sources. When choosing a protein source, note how much fat it contains. Choose cuts with higher amounts of fat and avoid leaner ones. Now, this is going to be so important and might very well be the difference between getting into ketosis and not. So you're going to want to do this for two reasons. The first one we talked about earlier, leaner cuts of meat are sometimes going to have higher amounts of alanine, and alanine can spike insulin. The second thing is that meat in general, so we're talking about beef, fish, chicken, have higher amounts of protein than fat. Sometimes it's double, sometimes it's triple. So you want to make sure that at most you go for the ratio that's 2-to-1. Fish are typically going to have lower amounts of fat relative to their protein. Make sure, and we're going to talk about this in the later section of fat, we use our tools. So our tools are going to be olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, butter, a lot of the fat tools, the liquefied fats that are going to help us beef up those fat numbers. So stay tuned for that. Let's go through some of these protein sources together. Let's start with beef. So we have New York strip, 7 ounces at 34 grams of fat. Ribeye, 11 ounces with 54 grams of fat. Delmonico, 8 ounces, 54 grams of fat. Skirt, 9 ounces, 30 grams of fat. And ground, make sure that it's no more than 85% lean. Now, you're not limited to these options only. I just picked the cuts of beef that have the highest amount of fat. Let's move on to pork. We've got bacon. 1 strip is going to have 3 grams of fat. Typically, a strip of bacon is going to have 5, 6, 7 grams of protein, so that's not too bad. Pork ribs, 6 ounces is going to be 13 grams of fat. And we have fish. Deeper the fish, the fattier. Simply put, if the fish lives in a deep sea environment, it's very likely that they have higher fat content in order to survive. Canned fish with olive oil. If you're getting it with water, we're not using the olive oil to beef up that fat content. So make sure that canned fish is in olive oil. And supplement with olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil, or butter. These are going to be such important tools for you. Typically, meat, fish, chicken, beef, they're going to have much higher protein content than fat. So use these tools. They are going to help you out. So this is protein sources continued, and we're talking about nuts and seeds here. Great source of protein because of ratio. In my opinion, nuts are going to have the best macronutrient ratio overall, plus so many great vitamins and minerals. A 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 ratio typically, and when eating protein, always think fat. So this is a general recommendation for eating protein. You always want to be thinking, am I getting enough fat from this source of protein? And if I'm not, maybe I need to use those tools that we talk about. Butter, olive oil, coconut oil, olive oil. So use those tools. They are going to be huge for the protein aspect of ketosis. So what do we take away from this section? When you're thinking protein, you're thinking fat. Whether you're eating beef, fish, pork, chicken, doesn't really matter. The amount of protein in these foods are going to exceed the amount of fat. All right, so make sure that you pick those sources with higher amounts of fat. And if you're having trouble finding them, we have our tools that we mentioned at the end of the section. We've got butter, we've got avocado oil, olive oil, we've got coconut oil. We've got these tools that'll help beef up our fat numbers. This section was huge. The next one is even bigger. We've got fat coming up. We're going to talk about the different types of fat, how they affect the body, how you can manipulate each type of fat to your advantage. Super excited. Let's get ready. Ketosis is in our reach. See you there. Welcome back, everybody. So we talked about protein and how it relates to past discussions. Protein, the specific amino acid alanine, and a couple of others can be responsible for an insulin response. So just keep that in mind. Whenever choosing a protein source, make sure that fat is going along with it. Make sure that meat source, that poultry source, that fish source is going to have nice marbling of fat, because remember, protein essentially is going to have double, triple, sometimes even quadruple the amount of fat. We're going to use our tools, which we're going to talk about in the next section. The next section is fat. This is where things get super fun and super interesting, and we have so many options in the fat category, and we're going to talk about how specific types of fat are going to point us in the direction of not only ketosis, but burning specific types of fat on your body. Let's get into it, guys. Super excited. See you there.